The stone beneath Marie Leroux's feet felt damp, cold through her wooden clogs. Above her family's cellar in Angerville-au-Plain, boots hammered across cobblestones. American boots, German boots, she couldn't tell which anymore. Her daughter, 8-year-old Simone, pressed against her side, whimpering. The girl's arm had been cut 3 days earlier by flying glass when artillery shattered their kitchen window. Now the wound wept yellow pus, hot to the touch. Marie had heard the stories whispered through the village in the days before. They'll burn you alive if they find you hiding. They'll put the children in the barns and set them alight. It was June 6th through 8th, 1944, and hell had come to Normandy. What happened next would shatter everything Marie believed about armies, about enemies, about who would show mercy when the world was on fire. The smell of the cellar had become unbearable, unwashed bodies, the sour tang of fear sweat, mouldy potatoes rotting in the corner. 12 people crammed into a space built for storing winter vegetables. They had been underground for nearly 48 hours. The sounds filtering through the vaulted stone ceiling told a story of chaos, the crump of mortars, the stutter of machine guns, the distant rumble of tanks grinding through hedgerow country. Sometimes voices shouted in German, sometimes in English, sometimes men screamed in no language at all, just animal sounds of pain. Marie's husband, Claude, crouched by the narrow stone steps that led up to their kitchen. He held a rusted pitchfork, useless against rifles, but it made him feel less helpless. The other men in the cellar clutched similar talismans, a hay rake, a kitchen knife, a length of iron pipe. If soldiers came down those steps, they would die defending their families. Everyone understood this. Maman, it hurts. Simone's voice was small, defeated. Marie pulled back the dirty cloth wrapped around her daughter's forearm. Even in the dim candlelight, she could see the red streaks climbing toward the elbow. Blood poisoning. In 3 more days, maybe 4, the infection would reach her heart. Marie had watched her own mother die this way in 1917 during the last war. 30 years later, the same death waited for her child. Above them, the shelling had stopped. The silence felt more dangerous than the noise. Claude tensed, knuckles white on the pitchfork handle. Footsteps approached their house. Multiple men, moving with purpose. Marie pulled Simone closer, covered the girl's mouth with her palm. If they stayed absolutely silent, perhaps the soldiers would pass by. Perhaps they would live another hour. The cellar door crashed open. Boots descended the stone steps. Ne tirez pas, Claude's voice cracked. Don't shoot. The pitchfork clattered to the floor as he raised his hands. The other men did the same, metal tools ringing against stone. But the man who appeared at the bottom of the stairs wasn't carrying a rifle. He wore an American uniform, olive drab and mud-splattered, with a white cloth armband bearing a red cross. He was young, maybe 22, 23 years old. His face was streaked with dirt and exhaustion. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. Blessés? Wounded? The cellar had become a held breath. Everyone stared at the American medic as if he might be a hallucination. Behind him, another soldier descended. Also young, also wearing the Red Cross armband. They carried canvas bags that clinked with glass and metal. Private Kenneth J. Moore stepped fully into the candlelight. His eyes swept across the civilians huddled in the darkness. Old men and women, mothers clutching children, a teenage boy with blood-soaked bandages around his head. He saw what every combat medic learned to see in the first days of war, the hierarchy of suffering, the calculus of who could be saved and in what order. His gaze locked on Simone's infected arm. Venez avec moi. Come with me. Marie didn't move. She had heard too many stories. German soldiers had told the villagers that Americans were savages, that they executed prisoners, that they burned villages for sport. Retreating Wehrmacht units had warned that anyone who cooperated with the invaders would be shot. And now, this boy in a foreign uniform, speaking broken French, wanted her to follow him out of their hiding place into the killing ground above. Private Robert E. Wright, the second medic, was already moving through the cellar, examining wounds with quick, professional efficiency. He pointed to 3 others, an elderly man with a shrapnel wound in his thigh, a woman with a compound fracture of the wrist, a young farmer whose abdomen showed the telltale swelling of internal bleeding. Church, Moore said in English. then switched to French, l'église, hôpital. The 12th century church of Saint-Côme-Saint-Damien stood 300 metres away. Its thick stone walls had survived 8 centuries of Norman weather and 3 wars. Now it would become something it had never been before, a battlefield aid station where American medics would erase the boundaries between friend and enemy, soldier and civilian, us and them. But Marie Leroux didn't know any of this yet. She only knew that her daughter was dying, and this stranger with kind eyes was offering something that looked like hope but might be a trap. What would you do? Trust the enemy who brings medicine, or trust the fear that says anyone in uniform will hurt you? Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if you're finding this story as surprising as I did researching it, hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, what happens next gets even more unbelievable. Moore reached out his hand, not grabbing, not commanding, just offering. Marie looked at her daughter's arm, then at Claude. Her husband's face was unreadable, terror and desperation, fighting for control. Finally he gave the smallest nod. Marie took the American's hand and let him guide Simone up the stone steps, into the smoke and ruin of D-Day Normandy, toward a church that would soon become a cathedral of impossible mercy. The mathematics of war were about to be rewritten, not with bullets and bombs, but with needles filled with a miracle drug that German civilians had never seen, that most French villagers didn't know existed, that would transform a scared little girl's infected wound from a death sentence to a recoverable injury in less than 72 hours. They were walking toward a scene that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives, not because of its horror, but because of its humanity. The smell hit Marie first, metallic blood mixing with the sharp chemical bite of antiseptic, overlaid with the musty ancient stone scent of the church itself. Then the sounds, men groaning in 3 languages, the wet tearing of bandages being changed, the clatter of metal instruments in tin basins. Finally, the sight that would never leave her, the wooden pews of Saint-Côme-Saint-Damien, dark with blood that had soaked into 800-year-old oak. This was where healing happened at the end of the world. Private Moore guided Marie and Simone through the church door, stepping over a German soldier who lay unconscious near the entrance, his chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. An American paratrooper sat propped against the north wall, both legs wrapped in crimson-soaked bandages, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands. Between them, a French farmer clutched his abdomen while Wright worked to stop internal bleeding with nothing but pressure, prayer, and improvised field dressings. 70 to 80 wounded had passed through this sanctuary in less than 3 days. Some would live. Some had already died here. Their bodies moved respectfully to the corner until burial became possible. The medics had worked 18-hour shifts under mortar fire that had punched holes in the roof, letting in shafts of dusty June light that illuminated scenes of suffering and salvation in equal measure. Moore sat Simone on a pew near the altar. The bench was still tacky with someone else's blood. Marie watched as the young American opened his canvas bag and withdrew items that looked like instruments of science fiction: a glass syringe, a small phial, a cotton swab soaked in brown iodine, and a tiny glass ampule containing clear liquid. Penicillin. By June of 1944, American pharmaceutical plants were producing roughly 100 billion Oxford units of the antibiotic each month, an industrial miracle that had transformed battlefield medicine. What had been a laboratory curiosity in 1941 was now standard equipment for frontline medics. The drug had already saved thousands of lives in North Africa and Italy. Soon it would save Simone Leroux's. But first, she had to stop screaming. Moore tried to explain what he was doing. Médecine, ça va aider. But Simone saw only the needle. She had watched neighbours die of infections. She had seen the doctor from Carentan amputate her uncle's gangrenous foot with a saw while men held him down. Now this foreign soldier wanted to stab her with a metal spike, and she fought with the desperate strength of a terrified child. Marie had to pin her daughter's shoulders, while Moore prepared the injection. He snapped the glass ampule, drew the clear liquid into the syringe, tapped out air bubbles with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times under fire. The needle pierced Simone's muscle. 600,000 units of penicillin flowed into tissue that was already inflamed, already fighting a losing battle against streptococcal infection. The girl sobbed. Marie sobbed. Moore moved on to the next patient without ceremony. There was no time for comfort. A German Obergefreiter had just been carried in, his left leg shattered by American machine gun fire. Behind him came 2 more Americans from the 101st Airborne, both with shrapnel wounds that wet blood and bocage mud. The medics triaged without prejudice: airway, breathing, circulation. American, German, French. It didn't matter. The Geneva Convention said medical personnel treated the wounded without discrimination. Moore and Wright treated humanity. Across the church, Wright was performing what looked like a miracle to the watching French civilians. An elderly man named Georges Petit had taken shrapnel in his thigh 2 days earlier. The wound had turned black at the edges, releasing the sickly sweet smell of gas gangrene, Clostridium perfringens bacteria feasting on dying tissue. In the previous war, Georges would have lost the leg or his life. Instead, Wright debrided the wound with a scalpel, cutting away dead flesh while Georges screamed into a rolled-up cloth. Then came the sulfanilamide powder, dusted directly into the cavity, followed by a penicillin injection that would hunt down bacteria in the bloodstream. Within 72 hours, the black edges would begin to pink. Within a week, Georges would walk again. Medicine as warfare against death itself. The church had become a strange democracy of suffering. On one pew, a Wehrmacht soldier from Bavaria lay next to a free French resistance fighter. They didn't speak. What was there to say? But they shared the same morphine syrettes, the same limited supply of blankets, the same 2 exhausted American kids who refused to let anyone die if they could prevent it. Marie watched a scene that rewrote her understanding of the universe. A German officer was brought in, gut-shot and delirious. Wright worked on him for 20 minutes, establishing an IV line improvised from rubber tubing and a plasma bottle. The officer kept mumbling, "Danke, danke," thank you, to his enemy. When he finally stabilized, Wright simply nodded and moved to the next. Patient, no celebration, no propaganda, just work. They were young men much like us, Moore would recall decades later, except they were wearing a different uniform. That was the revolution happening on the blood-stained pews of Angerville. Not a military revolution, but a moral one. In that church, nationality became irrelevant. Political ideology became noise. There was only the basic arithmetic of triage. Can this person be saved? Then save them. A mortar round struck the roof. Slate tiles exploded inward, raining down on the wounded. Moore threw himself over Simone and 2 other children. Wright covered the German officer. For 15 seconds the world was dust and thunder, then silence. Moore stood up, checked the children for new injuries, found none, and continued working. The locals who had gathered outside the church, those brave enough to emerge from cellars, witnessed something they would struggle to explain to their grandchildren. They saw Americans risk their lives to save Germans who had occupied their village for 4 years. They saw medics use precious medicine on French civilians while American soldiers waited their turn. They saw exhaustion transformed into duty, fear channeled into precision. One villager, crouched in the doorway, watched Marie cradle Simone and whispered to his wife, "They came like ghosts with needles and kindness." By the evening of June 7th, Simone's fever had broken. The red streaks climbing her arm had stopped advancing. The yellow pus had cleared to pink tissue. Marie touched her daughter's forehead. Cool, damp with healthy sweat rather than fever. The infection was retreating. Penicillin had won. But the real transformation was happening in Marie's mind, and in the minds of dozens of villagers who had hidden in the darkness expecting torture and found medicine instead. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. These were supposed to be the enemy, yet they fought harder to save French lives than the French had ever seen their own government fight. What happens when everything you've been told about good and evil turns out to be backwards? When the soldiers you feared become the healers you needed? When the uniform that should signal danger becomes the symbol of salvation? As night fell on June 8th, Moore and Wright were finally relieved by a proper medical evacuation team. They had been awake for over 60 hours. They had treated between 70 and 80 casualties. They had turned a medieval church into a modern hospital using nothing but training, improvisation, and an unwavering commitment to save every life they could reach. Before they left, Moore checked on Simone one last time. The girl was sleeping peacefully, her arm wrapped in clean bandages. He left 2 more ampules of penicillin with Marie, along with broken French instructions for continued treatment. Marie tried to thank him. The words stuck in her throat. How do you thank someone for giving you back your child's future? How do you reconcile that gift with 4 years of being told these men were monsters? Moore just smiled, exhausted, and walked out into the smoking ruins of Normandy to find the next person who needed saving. The blood on the pews would remain for 80 years, a permanent testimony to what happened when mercy met catastrophe. 3 weeks after Simone Leroux walked out of Saint-Corme-Saint-Damien with her life and her arm intact, the church still smelled of iodine and blood. The dark stains on the pews had oxidized to rust-brown permanent marks that resisted scrubbing. Villagers had tried, bringing buckets and brushes, determined to restore their sanctuary, but the wood had drunk too deeply of what happened there. The stains would remain. Some things, once witnessed, cannot be erased. By late June of 1944, the immediate battle for Normandy had shifted east toward Carentan and beyond, leaving Angoville-au-Plain in the strange limbo of the newly liberated. American supply convoys rolled through daily, heading toward the front. Military police directed traffic where German sentries had stood weeks earlier, and in cellars throughout the village, families were climbing back up into sunlight, blinking like creatures emerging from caves, trying to reconcile what they had been told with what they had seen. The cognitive dissonance was tearing apart 4 years of carefully constructed beliefs. Marie Leroux found herself at the center of this transformation. Simone's arm had healed cleanly, the infection gone, the wound closing with healthy pink scar tissue. But everywhere Marie went in the village, she encountered the same haunted looks, the same whispered questions. Is it true what they say about the Americans? Did they really save Germans and French together? Can we trust them? The answer was complicated. Trust built on rubble and confusion. Trust that felt dangerous because it contradicted everything. At the village fountain, where women gathered each morning to fill water jugs and exchange news, Marie encountered Madame Beaumont, whose son had been shot by retreating German soldiers for hiding a radio. The older woman's hatred was a living thing, poisonous and pure. She had vowed never to speak to a German again, never to show mercy to anyone who had worn that uniform. They treated them the same, Marie said quietly. The Americans, they treated everyone. Madame Beaumont's face hardened. The Germans murdered my son. I know. I remember. Marie shifted the water jug on her hip. But the medics, they didn't ask who was right or wrong. They just asked who was dying. What does it cost to let go of hate when hate is all that's kept you alive? The conversation ended there, but Marie saw it happen again and again throughout the village. Wounded German soldiers who had been treated at the church were now prisoners, being marched to collection points for transport to camps. Some villagers spat at them. Others stood silent, faces blank with confusion. A few, very few, nodded in grim acknowledgement of shared suffering. The boy from Bavaria who had lain next to the French resistance fighter would survive his wounds in an American field hospital, then spend 2 years in a prison camp in Oklahoma, eating better food than he had seen in Germany since 1940. The resistance fighter would return to his farm and spend 40 years trying to explain to his grandchildren why he couldn't completely hate the enemy who had bled beside him on a church pew. War had simplified the world. Us versus them, good versus evil, survival versus death. Peace, or whatever this was, made everything complicated again. By July, American military governance had established a makeshift clinic in the village school. A U.S. Army doctor arrived twice weekly to treat civilian medical needs that had been ignored or untreated for years. He brought sulfur drugs, penicillin, basic surgical supplies, and a translator who spoke decent French. The lines outside the school stretched down the street. Women with infected teeth that had rotted for lack of dentistry. Children with rickets from malnutrition. Old men with hernias they'd lived with for a decade because German military doctors only treated Wehrmacht personnel. the accumulated medical neglect of occupation, waiting to be addressed by an army that had just liberated them from the previous army. Marie brought Simone for a follow-up examination. The American doctor, Captain James Morrison from Pennsylvania, unwrapped the bandages and nodded with satisfaction. Clean healing, no complications. Another week, she won't need dressings. Through the translator, Marie asked the question that had been burning in her mind. Why did they save the Germans? Morrison looked at her for a long moment. Because they were wounded. Because we could. Because if we start choosing who deserves medicine based on which government they fight for, we become something we don't want to be. The translator struggled with the last part, but Marie understood. She had watched it happen in real time. American boys, barely older than her nephew, maintaining their humanity in conditions designed to strip humanity away. Maintaining it deliberately, consciously, as an act of defiance against everything war tried to make them become. Medicine as moral statement. The village priest, Father Dubois, had returned to his church after evacuating during the heaviest fighting. He found his sanctuary transformed, the altar draped with blood-soaked bandages left to dry, empty morphine syringes scattered on the floor, gouges in the stone where medics had pried out mortar fragments to use as improvised surgical tools. The sight had driven him to his knees, weeping, not from despair, from something closer to awe. He held Mass the following Sunday. Every pew was full, Catholic families who had attended for generations, plus a handful of American soldiers from the 101st Airborne who had returned to see the church they'd heard about, the place where their comrades had turned a medieval relic into a modern hospital. Father Dubois spoke in French, but his message needed no translation. He gestured to the dark stains on the wood, the holes in the roof that still awaited repair, the crucifix that had remained untouched throughout 3 days of trauma and triage. This is holy ground now, he said, not because of prayer, though we have prayed here for 800 years, but because strangers chose mercy when the world chose murder, because young men decided that every life was worth fighting for, even when those lives belonged to enemies. One of the American soldiers, a private who had been wounded at Utah Beach and evacuated through the church, stood up. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the gesture when Father Dubois motioned him forward. The priest embraced him. Then he invited the congregation to do the same. The line of villagers stretched out the door. Each one shook hands or embraced the Americans. Some wept. Some whispered thank you in broken English. Others simply held on, as if physical contact could bridge the linguistic and cultural chasm between them. Madame Beaumont stood in that line. When she reached the soldiers, she stopped. Her face was a battlefield, grief and gratitude warring for control. Finally, she reached out and touched the red cross patch on one medic's sleeve. Just touched it, then walked away. It wasn't forgiveness. Forgiveness might never come, but it was acknowledgement that complexity exists, that enemies can be human, that the world contains more than simple categories of good and evil. Small miracles built from blood and penicillin. By August, stories from Angerville had spread throughout liberated Normandy. Other villages reported similar experiences, American medics treating French and German wounded without distinction, sharing scarce medical supplies, risking death to save enemy lives. The pattern was consistent enough to be policy, widespread enough to be culture. This was how America fought, with overwhelming industrial capacity married to an ethical framework that refused to dehumanize even enemies. The penicillin that saved Simone's arm was the same drug saving German prisoners in field hospitals across France. The blood plasma keeping wounded Wehrmacht soldiers alive came from voluntary American donors who had never asked if their blood would be used for friend or foe. The arsenal of democracy had weaponized compassion. Marie Leroux kept the empty penicillin ampoules Moore had left her. She placed them on a shelf in her kitchen, next to the family crucifix and her wedding photograph. When Simone asked what they were, Marie told her the story. All of it. The fear, the hiding, the American with kind eyes who had asked them to trust him. The church filled with wounded men in 3 different uniforms. The miracle drug that pulled infection back from death's door. Remember this, Marie told her daughter. Remember that enemies brought you medicine when you needed it most. Remember that the world is more complicated than anyone tells you. Simone would carry those ampules for 70 years. She would show them to her own children, then her grandchildren, explaining that they represented the day everything changed. The day her mother learned to trust strangers. The day American soldiers proved that victory could be humane. The day penicillin turned fear into memory. But the story wasn't finished. 2 young medics had disappeared into the chaos of war, leaving behind only bloodstains and gratitude. The village would spend decades trying to find them, to say thank you properly, to understand what drove men barely out of adolescence to risk everything for people they'd never see again. The answer, when it finally came, would be simpler and more profound than anyone expected. 1994. 50 years after D-Day, an elderly woman with silver hair stood in the church of Saint-Corme-Saint-Damien, running her fingers across dark stains on a wooden pew. Simone Leroux, now Simone Beaumont, married, grandmother of 4, could still feel the ghost of infection in her arm, the phantom heat of fever, the terror of that June morning when her mother had trusted a stranger with a needle. The church had become a pilgrimage site. Historians came with notebooks. Veterans arrived with memories. Tourists photographed the bloodstains that centuries of weather and worship had failed to erase. But for 50 years, the village had searched for 2 names. The military records were fragmentary. The chaos of D-Day had scattered documentation like leaves in a hurricane. Hundreds of medics had served with the 101st Airborne. Dozens had worked in improvised aid stations throughout Normandy. Which 2 had transformed a medieval church into a cathedral of mercy? Which 2 had saved Simone's life? The search had become Angeville's obsession. Father Dubois, before his death in 1968, had written letters to the US Army, to veteran organizations, to anyone who might help identify the medics. The responses were polite but inconclusive. So many men, so many acts of courage, the records incomplete. Then, in 1983, a breakthrough. A veteran named Kenneth J. Moore read a magazine article about a church in France where medics had treated wounded without regard to nationality. Something in the description triggered memory. The vaulted stone ceiling, the wooden pews, the mortars punching through the roof while they worked. That was us, he told his wife. Bob Wright and me, that was our aid station. The phone call that reached Angeville 3 days later changed everything. After 39 years, the village finally had names to attach to their gratitude. Kenneth Moore and Robert Wright, no longer ghosts or legends, but real men with addresses in Alabama and Oregon, men who had carried on with ordinary lives after doing extraordinary things. The reunion happened in June of 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day. Moore and Wright returned to Normandy as honoured guests, walking streets they'd last seen through smoke and chaos. The entire village turned out, 3 generations of people who owed their existence to decisions made by 2 exhausted 20-something medics who had simply refused to let anyone die if they could prevent it. Simone embraced Moore first. She was 52 years old, a schoolteacher with grandchildren. He was 64, retired from a quiet life running a hardware store. They held each other and wept. This old woman who had been a terrified child, this old man who had been a terrified soldier, connected across 4 decades by a needleful of penicillin and an act of stubborn humanity. "I don't remember your face," Simone admitted through tears, "but I remember your hands. They were gentle." Moore touched the scar on her arm, barely visible now beneath age-spotted skin. "You were so scared. I wanted to tell you it would be okay, but my French was terrible." "You didn't need words," Simone said. "You just needed to be there." Wright stood nearby, surrounded by villagers who grabbed his hands, touched his shoulders, needed physical contact to make the memory real. An elderly man, Georges Petit, who had nearly lost his leg to gas gangrene, knelt before Wright and kissed his hand. The gesture embarrassed the former medic profoundly. "I was just doing my job," Wright kept saying. Any medic would have done the same. But that wasn't true, and everyone knew it. Many medics would have done their jobs. Moore and Wright had done something more. They had held the line between civilization and barbarism in a place where that line should have dissolved entirely. The village had prepared something, Father Dubois' successor, Father Laurent, unveiled new stained-glass windows installed above the altar. The glass depicted 2 American soldiers in medic uniforms, kneeling beside wounded men. The faces were deliberately left indistinct, universal, but the Red Cross armbands blazed in afternoon light, red as blood, white as surrender to compassion. Below the windows, a brass plaque listed names, the American, German, and French wounded who had been treated in the church during those 72 hours. 32 names, recovered from military records and village memory, each one a life that might have ended on those blood-stained pews. The ceremony drew international press. The story spread of enemy soldiers treated equally, of penicillin administered without politics, of 2 young men who embodied the best of what America claimed to be. Moore and Wright were awarded Silver Stars decades late. The French government gave them the Légion d'honneur. But the recognition that mattered most came from the villagers who simply said thank you over and over in accented English, learned for this moment. What no one expected was the German veteran who arrived the next day. He was 73 years old, thin and stooped, carrying a worn photograph of himself as a 20-year-old Obergefreiter with the 7th Panzer Division. Hans Dietrich had been gut-shot on June 7th, evacuated to the church, treated by American medics while his own army retreated without him. He had survived, spent 2 years as a prisoner, returned to Germany, married, raised children, and carried a question for 40 years. Why did they save me? He found Moore at the village cafe, drinking coffee with veterans from the 101st. The conversation was halting, conducted in broken English and French, with a local teacher translating the German. But the core message was clear. "I came to kill you," Dietrich said simply. "That was my job, and when I was dying, you saved me instead. I need to understand why." Moore looked at this elderly German, seeing past the age to the wounded boy on the church floor. "Because you were 19 years old and bleeding to death. What else was I supposed to do?" "Hate me. Let me die. My people had occupied this village for 4 years. You weren't your people. You were a kid with a hole in your gut." Dietrich began to cry, silent tears tracking down weathered cheeks. "I went home and I built a life that should not exist. Every day I wonder if I deserve to live, if saving an enemy was the right thing." Wright spoke for the first time. "We saved everyone we could reach. American, German, French, didn't matter. We were medics. Our job was life, not death." "But I would have killed you." "Maybe. Probably. But when you were wounded, you weren't a soldier anymore. You were just a patient, and patients don't get to die because we're angry at their government." The conversation lasted 2 hours. Other German veterans arrived, men who had been treated in American aid stations, who had survived to build the democratic West Germany that had emerged from Nazi ruins. They met the medics who had saved them, shook hands with men they'd tried to kill, struggled to process the moral complexity of enemies showing mercy, medicine as moral education. That night, the village held a feast. Tables stretched down the main street, laden with food that would have seemed impossible in 1944. American veterans sat with German veterans, both groups now elderly, both remembering the same war from opposite sides. French families moved between tables, refilling wine glasses, bringing bread, facilitating conversations between men who shared scars and nightmares but not languages. Simone gave a speech, her voice carried through the summer evening, strong and clear. "For 50 years, we lived with a question. What do we owe strangers who saved us? How do we repay a debt that can never be repaid? Today I understand that we don't repay it. We remember it. We pass it forward." She gestured to the church, illuminated now by floodlights, its stained glass windows glowing. Every child in this village learns the story, not as propaganda, not as hero worship, but as a reminder that when the world becomes hell, some people choose to be angels, that humanity persists in conditions designed to destroy it, that medicine and mercy can be weapons against the worst impulses of war. The applause rolled through the street like thunder. Moore and Wright returned to Angoville multiple times before their deaths, Moore in 2004, Wright in 2013. Each visit drew crowds. Each visit reinforced the mythology that had grown around those 72 hours in June of 1944. But it wasn't false mythology. The bloodstains proved it. The recovered patients proved it. The transformed village proved it. Today, over 80 years later, the Church of Saint-Comet-Saint-Damien stands as an unofficial museum. The pews remain dark with blood that will never wash away. Visitors leave flowers, dog tags, and photographs of loved ones who served. The stained glass windows catch afternoon light, scattering red and white across stone floors where wounded men once bled in 3 languages. A small museum annex displays artifacts, empty penicillin ampules, rusted surgical tools, the canvas bags Moore and Wright carried. One exhibit shows a timeline of penicillin development, from Alexander Fleming's 1928 discovery to the industrial-scale production that put miracle drugs in the hands of frontline medics by D-Day. Another shows letters from German veterans thanking their American saviors, written decades after the war. The most powerful exhibit is simplest, a list of names and what became of them. Simone Leroux Beaumont, schoolteacher, lived to 92. Georges Petit, farmer, lived to 87. Hans Dietrich, engineer, lived to 93. 32 lives saved. 187 children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren who exist because 2 medics refused to let nationality determine who deserved to live. The mathematics of mercy compound across generations. The village holds an annual memorial service on June 6th. Veterans attend when they can, though their numbers dwindle with each year. German and American flags hang side by side in the church. The service includes readings from Moore's and Wright's letters, testimony from survivors, and always, always, a moment of silence for the wounded who did not survive, the men who died on those pews despite everything the medics tried. Because mercy has limits. Penicillin can't stop arterial bleeding. Morphine can't repair shattered spines. Some wounds were simply too catastrophic. Some arrived too late. Some bodies had already surrendered to death before they reached the church doors. But the ones who could be saved were saved. Without question, without prejudice, without pause to consider politics or nationality, or whether enemies deserved mercy. Moore and Wright had operated on a simpler calculus. This person is dying. I can help, therefore I must. That principle, simple, radical, humane, transformed everyone who witnessed it. The villagers learned that enemies could be human. The German veterans learned that mercy exists even in hell. The American veterans learned that their values meant something, that the rhetoric about freedom and dignity translated into action when it mattered most. And Simone Leroux Beaumont lived 8 more decades because a stranger with kind eyes chose to see a sick child instead of collateral damage. She died in 2016 at 92, surrounded by family. On her bedside table sat 2 glass ampules, empty for 72 years, catching light through the hospital window. Her last words, according to her granddaughter, were simple. "Tell them I remembered. Tell them we all remembered. The church remembers. The bloodstains remember. The village remembers. And now you remember too, the day when American soldiers brought medicine instead of torches, when enemies became patients, when 2 exhausted medics turned a medieval cathedral into a monument to what humanity can be when it refuses to surrender to hate. They'll burn you alive." That's what fear promised. Instead, they brought penicillin and saved your life. That's what actually happened. That's what still echoes through a stone church in Normandy, where the pews remain dark with blood, and the light through stained glass falls like blessing on a floor where miracles once worked, by the simple refusal to let anyone die. The arsenal of democracy, it turns out, carried more than bullets. Sometimes it carried hope in a glass ampule. Sometimes that was enough.